Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. Look, if we're gearing up for the CMA exams, getting a rock-solid handle on the objectives of strategic management is absolutely crucial. So we're going to skip the fluff, dive straight into the source material, and break these complex ideas down into something you can actually remember. Let's get right into it.
So check out this quote. Strategies do not happen just by themselves. I mean, it sounds super obvious, right? But the text really hammers this point home right out of the gate. Strategy is a highly active, totally human-driven process. It involves real people, especially the managers who actually have to make the tough calls and implement the plans. It doesn't just magically appear out of thin air. It relies entirely on leadership's ability to navigate some pretty tricky environments.
To make this super easy to recall on exam day, we're going to chunk the 10 core objectives into a really clear roadmap. We'll look at the operational versus strategic divide, then opportunities and frameworks, sustaining competitive advantage, stakeholders and customers, and finally wrap up with the survival mindset. All right, starting off with section 1, the operational versus strategic divide. It's actually really fascinating to look at the shift in perspective here. Think about it like a building. Operational tasks base sit squarely on the ground floor and the middle levels, dealing mostly with the routine, day-to-day stuff. But when you zoom out and move up to top management, the view completely changes. We're suddenly shifting from these daily tactical decisions to a much broader, high-level strategic view. Let's put these two side by side. Operational managers are right there in the trenches with routine control. We're talking efficient production, managing the sales force, tracking daily finances. It's very operation-specific. But strategic management, that's all about organization-wide implications. It's complex, it's ambiguous, and it's definitely non-routine. And here's a massive takeaway for your exam. A huge hurdle for organizations is that managers spend literally years being trained in those operational routines. So making the leap into the murky, ambiguous waters of strategy, yeah, that's a really tough transition for most folks. Which naturally brings us to the million-dollar question. If strategic management is all about navigating this wild, complex, non-routine environment, what exactly are the objectives? What are we actually trying to pull off up there at the 30,000-foot view? Well, let's break down the 10 core objectives into our logical buckets. Moving into section 2, opportunities and frameworks. Focusing on how managers structure their world, we hit our first 3 objectives. First up, a strategic manager has to spot external opportunities and then adapt their internal resources to exploit them. The catch this, they don't just sit around waiting for lightning to strike. The second objective is to actively create those opportunities by really stretching the organization's resources and competencies. And since that gets messy, the third objective is all about using conceptual frameworks. You absolutely need these frameworks to make sense of the tangled web between your actions, the business context, and your ultimate performance. Okay, section 3, sustaining competitive advantage. The source material groups objectives 4, 5, and 6 under one giant umbrella, helping the organization actually enjoy a competitive advantage. But getting to the top isn't enough, right? Objective 5 is to sustain and improve that spot by constantly scooping up the right resources and keeping a very close eye on environmental changes. Then, Objective 6 is your defensive playbook, avoiding failure. How do we do that? By locking in continuous improvement, learning from mistakes, tracking the absolute best industry practices, and relentless benchmarking. Now pay close attention because this is a massive key for your CMA prep. How exactly does strategic management avoid failure? By obsessing over 4 specific building blocks. These are superior efficiency, superior quality, superior innovation, and superior responsiveness to your customers. If a company takes its eye off these 4 blocks, strategic failure is basically guaranteed. But who actually decides if your quality and responsiveness are superior? That brings us to section 4, stakeholders and customers. Here's the thing. Strategic management can't just stare at its own navel. It has to look outward. A good strategic leader is constantly monitoring and responding to the demands of key stakeholders. And more specifically, they have to identify the critical success factors needed to meet the incredibly specific needs and wants of the customers. Because at the end of the day, the customer is the ultimate judge, jury, and executioner of your strategy. The text spells this out beautifully. Critical success factors, or CSFs, are those make-or-break areas of performance. They literally must go right for the business to keep its customers happy.
The material points out that customer satisfaction is completely tied to things like cost, quality, reliability, delivery, and cool new products. Figuring out which of these factors are critical for your specific market, that is a fundamental objective of strategic management. Finally, Section 5, the survival mindset. The source reminds us that in a world that never stops changing, strategic management has to overcome organizational inertia. You literally have to embrace change just to stay competitive, and honestly, sometimes just to survive. To pull that off, the final objective is developing a genuinely creative and innovative attitude. You have to actively train your brain to think strategically, breaking out of the rigid, predictable habits of day-to-day operations. And I think this completely captures the big takeaway from today's explainer. Strategy is the antidote to operational inertia. Sure, top-tier operational management keeps the lights on and makes sure today runs smoothly. But it's strategic management that makes sure the whole building isn't left in the dust as the rest of the world speeds by. So as you grind through your CMA prep, I want you to ask yourself, are you ready to step out of the comfortable operational routine and actually embrace the ambiguity of strategic leadership? Keep these 10 objectives locked in your memory, really understand the difference between the operational and strategic levels, and you are going to absolutely crush these concepts on the exam.
You know, when we usually think of a corporation, we immediately picture balance sheets, profit margins, and boardrooms, right? But today, we're going to look at its biological makeup, its DNA. If you're a CMA student prepping for your exams, you absolutely need a solid framework to understand how businesses operate at their core. So today, we're building a powerful mental model. We're going to look at the modern corporation not just as a financial entity, but as a living, breathing organism with its own unique genetic code. So, ask yourself, what actually makes up the complex structures, environments, and behavioral interactions of a modern business? How do all these distinct pieces, the individual people, the departments, the external pressures, come together to function as one cohesive body? Well, thinking about a company through the lens of its DNA allows us to take these massively complex systems and break them down into pieces that are understandable, testable, and highly predictable. All right, let's dive into our roadmap for today's explainer. We'll be tracking from the macro level, decoding organizational genomics, and looking at boundary-spanning departments. Then we'll move through the communication network, and finally, we'll zoom all the way down to the micro level of individual psychology and group dynamics.
Starting with Section 1, Decoding Organizational Genomics. Let's set the stage by defining the core concepts that dictate how a corporation survives and interacts with its environment. The big term we are focusing on here is organizational genomics. Just like human genomics studies your genes and how they interact with your environment, organizational genomics acts as our framework for understanding corporate structures. We're studying a corporation's structural and behavioral genes. Every modern corporation organizes itself based on this genetic makeup to essentially survive and manage its interactions with the outside world.
And who exactly makes up that outside world? Stakeholders. A stakeholder is simply any person or group associated with the organization that has a stake in its output. We're talking workers, managers, the government, customers, the whole shebang. Now imagine trying to organize, communicate, and respond to all of these different groups at once. It's a massive challenge, right? They all want different things, which puts a lot of pressure on the corporate organism.
Which brings us to Section 2, Boundary-Spanning Departments. This is exactly how corporations structuralize to solve that massive stakeholder challenge.
To deal with all those external pressures without falling into total chaos, the company builds specific structural genes designed to literally cross the borders of the organization. We call these boundary-spanning departments. Establishing these is the absolute most efficient way to interact across the lines that divide the company from its stakeholders. These are literal offices, like public affairs, investor relations, customer relations, and community relations. Each one is a targeted adaptation to handle a specific external environment smoothly.
Now, let's move to Section 3 and look at the interaction layer that keeps this entire corporate body alive, the communication network.
Exam spotlight right here, guys. Organizational communication is formally defined as the forms and channels of interaction required to direct a group toward a set of common goals. It can be formal or completely informal. It can flow up, down, or sideways, and it uses all sorts of media. But here is the critical takeaway for your studies. Research consistently proves there is a super strong relationship between communication levels in a company and its overall job performance and satisfaction. It's the nervous system of the business.
Think about how these vital communication flows are actually structured.
On the inside, you've got management creating directions, instructing employees, and gathering feedback to keep morale up. But on the outside, the organization is constantly negotiating the sale of goods, making purchases, and liaising with government bodies. It's a constant, simultaneous flow of internal direction and external negotiation, and both are completely necessary for survival.
Because this communication is so incredibly vital, keeping it healthy requires major managerial proficiency. In fact, a manager's primary responsibility is to develop and maintain this exact system. It's not just about sending clear emails. A manager has to actively play detective. They need to discover barriers to communication, analyze exactly why they are happening, and then take proactive steps to prevent them in the future. You're basically troubleshooting human interaction.
Okay, moving to Section 4, Group Dynamics and Behavior. We're zooming in now from the broad communication network to the specific psychological dynamics of the workgroup. After all, corporate DNA is just made up of people. You will definitely want to remember this sharp contrast for the exam. An employee's positive attitude doesn't just come out of nowhere. It depends heavily on mutual relationships within a workgroup categorized into two systems. First is the outer system. That's the formal side, defined by the organization structure and its technologies. But the inner system is deeply human. It refers to the mutual relationships created simply by cooperating on business and essentially living together in a work environment day after day.
Within these work groups, individuals develop a ton of interactions, and a person's behavior depends sequentially on three specific psychological processes. First, cognitive processes, how they think and perceive information. Second, emotional processes, the feelings they develop through that interaction. And third, cognitive processes, their personal drive and proactive behavior. Now, these feelings might be demonstrated publicly, or they can be totally hidden in subtle verbal and symbolic expressions, which can be interpreted very differently from one person to another. It's a complex psychological web.
Which brings us to our final module, Section 5, the trap of self-estimation. Let's put the individual employee directly under the microscope to look at how they estimate their own worth within this environment.
In any work environment, employees are constantly judging and comparing themselves to others. It's just human nature. Based on those comparisons, they form an opinion of their own worth and abilities. But here's the trap. How objectively can an individual actually estimate themselves? Objective estimation relies entirely on the nature, personality, and mental health of that individual aligning strictly with reality and real-life values. And let's be honest, that doesn't always happen.
In fact, there are 5 very specific situations that result in incorrect self-estimation. Memorize these as they are highly testable. Incorrect estimation often manifests as underestimating people with lower qualifications or showing intolerance toward those on a higher social or financial level. It also includes holding a high opinion of oneself that simply isn't backed up by facts, feeling chronically inferior, or, interestingly, doing a truly great job but concealing your true positive opinion of yourself. Any of these 5 situations creates friction and disrupts the healthy functioning of the group.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a critical question to reflect on for your own career. Knowing how complex these structural genes, communication networks, and psychological behaviors really are, as a future financial manager, how accurately and objectively are you estimating the corporate DNA around you? Understanding organizational genomics isn't just about passing the CMA exam. It's a literal blueprint for diagnosing and leading the living organism that is a modern business.
If you're prepping for your CMA exam, you already know that understanding the theoretical frameworks behind leadership isn't just about, checking a box to pass a test. It's actually about grasping the real-world mechanics of modern business. So we're going to break down exactly what makes an organization successful right from the very top.
This explainer is basically your exam blueprint. We've got 5 main sections to get through today. Section 1, the goal, maximizing value. Section 2, defining strategic leadership. 3, key leadership characteristics. 4, emotional intelligence. And finally, Section 5, Goleman's 5 EQ attributes. Let's get to it.
Starting off with Section 1, the goal, maximizing value. We really have to start with the fundamental goal of the firm here, because it sets the exact stage for why strategic leadership is even a thing. I mean, you can't lead effectively if you don't know exactly where you're trying to go, right?
Now, for your CMA exam, the absolute most critical distinction to grasp right off the bat is the difference between short-term profit maximization and long-term value maximization. Profit maximization, that's basically just a single-period, short-term goal. A firm could easily boost its short-term profits by, say, cutting all of its crucial research and development. But obviously that hurts the company later. It sacrifices long-term profitability. Wealth or value maximization, on the other hand, that is the preferred, comprehensive goal. Why? Because it thinks about the long game. It factors in the risk and uncertainty of the business environment, it recognizes the time value of money, and it ensures the firm actually has a solid supply of future capital. Former Coca-Cola CEO Roberto Goizueta actually hit the nail on the head with this. He said that increasing shareholder value over time is the bottom line of every move a company makes. And that brilliantly illustrates the point. By maximizing wealth, shareholders get to optimize their consumption over time, and that is ultimately what you see reflected in the market value of the company's shares.
Moving to Section 2, defining strategic leadership. So what actually drives that value creation out there in a highly competitive environment? Because, spoiler alert, it definitely doesn't happen by accident.
The crucial point to remember here is that strategic leadership centers entirely on an individual. It's an individual upon whom strategy development and change are highly dependent. These leaders are tasked with a really delicate balancing act, balancing profit growth with overall profitability, all to hit that ultimate goal of maximizing shareholder value. They are the catalyst. If an organization is going to successfully navigate a shifting environment and hold on to a competitive advantage, it literally all relies on how effective its strategic leadership is. Okay, Section 3, key leadership characteristics. So what exactly does this kind of individual look like in practice? What specific traits actually allow them to achieve that high level of performance? Well, here are the 5 core traits you absolutely need to memorize. These are what ensure a leader can set a direction and really embed it into the company's DNA. First up, they've got to be a visionary. They need a clear, compelling sense of exactly where the organization should be heading. Second, they have to eloquently communicate this vision, and I mean over and over again until it essentially becomes part of the organizational culture. Third, they need to articulate a business model that perfectly fits and supports that vision. Fourth, they have to demonstrate total, unwavering commitment to this model through both their words and their actions. And fifth, they proactively build out a strong network of both formal and informal sources, just so they can stay totally dialed in to everything happening in and around the organization.
But here's a quick reality check for you. How does a strategic leader actually pull all of this off without just completely drowning in responsibilities? A visionary simply cannot do everything alone. And that brings us to a highly testable area for your exam, the actual mechanics of execution and delegation. Think about it. If a leader tries to force every single idea and do every single task, the whole organization is going to bottleneck and fail.
So to execute efficiently, leaders have to rely on their teams. Step 1. Empower your subordinates to make decisions. This doesn't just take a massive load off the leader's plate, it actually acts as a huge motivator for the team itself. But pay close attention to Step 2 here. In this process of delegation, the strategic leader absolutely does not delegate the responsibilities that are of critical importance to the success of the organization. You have to keep a tight grip on those. And Step 3. Instead of just using raw, top-down authority to force ideas through, a true strategic leader works to develop a consensus among their subordinates.
All right, moving on to Section 4, emotional intelligence, or EQ. Now we're pivoting to the psychological engine that actually drives all of those leadership traits we just talked about. You can have all the vision in the world, but if you lack the mental framework to execute it with real people, it all falls apart.
So how do we estimate someone's psychological capabilities to lead? We look at Daniel Goleman's 1998 framework. He coined the term emotional intelligence, or EQ, to describe a very specific bundle of psychological attributes. And the source material explicitly states that many strong and effective leaders exhibit these specific traits. It is quite literally the secret sauce that separates a purely analytical, by-the-book manager from a truly transformative strategic leader.
And that brings us to our final part, Section 5, Goleman's 5 EQ attributes. Let's break down exactly what these big 5 psychological attributes are so you're totally ready for the exam.
This table right here is a high-yield summary mapping the specific traits directly to their textbook definitions. First is self-awareness. This is your ability to understand your own moods, emotions, and drives and how they actually affect the people around you. Second is self-regulation. This means controlling or redirecting disruptive impulses. Basically, it's the ability to think before you act. Third, we have motivation. And this isn't just about a paycheck. It's a propensity to pursue goals with real energy and persistence, a passion for work beyond money or status. Fourth is empathy. This is the ability to truly understand the feelings and viewpoints of your subordinates, and then actually taking them into account when you make decisions. And finally, social skills. Goleman defines this brilliantly as simply friendliness with a purpose.
Now,
According to Goleman, these internal regulatory traits, specifically being self-aware and self-regulating, make individuals significantly more confident and open to change. The business landscape is never static, right? Well, these leaders are uniquely equipped to cope with ambiguity. Because they have a solid handle on their own internal state, the external chaos of a complex business environment just doesn't derail them.
Furthermore, because they actively recognize their own limitations, these leaders naturally elicit immense respect, trust, and confidence from their subordinates. Think about it for a second. People naturally respect leaders who are self-aware enough to admit what they don't know and who are self-regulating enough to consider their decisions carefully instead of just acting on impulse. Those two attributes combined act like an absolute magnet for team confidence.
And finally, let's talk about motivation. A leader's relentless energy and persistence in pursuing goals is actually highly infectious. When a leader exhibits a genuine, authentic passion for the work that goes way beyond just getting a paycheck, that strong motivation creates a ripple effect throughout the entire organization. It motivates subordinates to give their absolute best. It's basically the ultimate catalyst for high performance.
Mastering these concepts is without a doubt absolutely essential for passing your CMA exam. But beyond the test, it challenges you to evaluate your own readiness to lead in tomorrow's business world. By understanding the critical distinction between short-term profit and long-term wealth maximization, by identifying the core traits of strategic leadership, and by developing those 5 pillars of emotional intelligence, you are setting yourself up for serious success. Keep these concepts fresh in your mind, and you're going to do great. So as we wrap up this explainer, I'll leave you with this one thought to chew on. Do you currently possess the strategic foresight and the emotional intelligence required to truly maximize value in your own organization?